3 gunshots echoed through Copper Valley 15 years ago. They killed my wife and daughter. The sheriff called it robbery gone wrong. I found the truth in blood-soaked ledgers and whispered confessions. The men who murdered my family weren't outlaws. They were lawmen. And the one who gave the order still wears his badge. What's the saying? Oh, well, howdy, stranger. Old Jack at your service. Though the only service I've got is flapping my gums and telling, you're here to hear a story. So lean in. The town of Copper Valley hadn't changed much in 15 years. The same weathered buildings lined the dusty main street, their paint peeling under the relentless Nevada sun. The same saloon doors creaked on rusty hinges, spilling the sounds of piano music and drunken laughter into the evening air. The same gallows stood in the town square, its noose swaying gently in the hot wind like a reminder that justice here was swift, brutal, and often wrong. Daniel Cross rode into town just as the sun began its descent toward the distant mountains, painting the sky in shades of blood orange and deep purple. His horse moved slow and deliberate, its hooves kicking up small clouds of dust that hung in the still air. Daniel himself sat straight in the saddle, his broad-brimmed hat casting shadows across a face that had been carved hard by years of grief and purpose. His duster was travel-worn but well-maintained, and the twin revolvers at his hips rode easy in their holsters, not the weapons of a showman, but the tools of a man who knew how to use them. People noticed him immediately. In a town like Copper Valley, strangers were rare enough to draw attention, and this stranger had the look of someone who brought storms with him. Old women pulled back from windows. Shopkeepers paused in their sweeping to watch him pass. Men playing cards on the saloon porch let their hands fall idle as they tracked his progress down the street. Daniel felt their eyes on him, felt the weight of recognition beginning to stir in some of the older residents. He'd been gone 15 years, but some faces never truly leave a place, especially when those faces belonged to ghosts people thought they'd buried. He stopped his horse in front of the sheriff's office, a squat building with barred windows and a porch that sagged slightly on one side. The sign above the door read Sheriff Marcus Brennan in faded gold lettering. Daniel stared at that name for a long moment, his jaw tightening until the muscles jumped beneath his weathered skin. Marcus Brennan, the man who'd stood at Daniel's door 15 years ago with his hat in his hands and lies on his tongue. The man who'd spoken words of sympathy while Daniel's wife and daughter lay cooling in their own blood inside the house. The man who'd promised justice that never came. The man who'd ordered their deaths. Daniel dismounted slowly, tying his horse to the hitching post with methodical care. His hands were steady. They'd been steady for years now, trained through countless hours of practice until emotion no longer interfered with aim. He stepped onto the porch, his boots heavy against the worn planks, and pushed open the door without knocking. The interior was dim and cool, a welcome relief from the heat outside. A single lamp burned on the desk, casting long shadows across wanted posters tacked to the walls. Behind that desk sat Marcus Brennan, older now but still recognizable. His hair had gone gray at the temples, his face had grown jowls, and his gut pressed against his vest buttons. But his eyes, those cold, calculating eyes, were exactly as Daniel remembered. Brennan looked up from the paperwork spread before him, his expression shifting from mild annoyance to genuine shock in the space of a heartbeat. His hand moved instinctively toward the revolver on his desk, but he stopped when he saw that Daniel's hands were empty, resting casually at his sides. "Daniel Cross," Brennan said slowly, his voice carrying the rough texture of too much whiskey and too many cigars. "I'll be damned. We all thought you were dead." "You hoped I was dead," Daniel replied quietly. His voice was soft, but it carried an edge like a blade drawn across leather. "Hoped I'd drunk myself into an early grave somewhere out in the territories, or put a bullet in my own head out of grief." Brennan's face twitched, not quite a smile, but something close to satisfaction. "Can't say the thought didn't occur to me. Man loses his family like you did. Sometimes death's a mercy." "Is that what you tell yourself?" Daniel took a single step forward, his presence somehow filling the small office, despite his stillness. "That you were being merciful?" The sheriff's hand moved closer to his gun. I don't know what you're implying, Cross, but I suggest you watch your tongue. I'm still the law in this town. The law? Daniel's laugh was brief and bitter. You wear that badge like it means something, like it makes you righteous. But I know what you are, Brennan. I know what you did. The temperature in the room seemed to drop despite the evening heat. Brennan's eyes narrowed, his fingers now touching the grip of his revolver. You're talking crazy. The grief's rotted your brain. I spent 15 years tracking down the truth, Daniel continued, his voice never rising above that same quiet intensity. Took me to 3 territories and cost me everything I had left. But I found them, Brennan. I found the men who killed my family. Outlaws, Brennan said quickly, too quickly. We investigated. They were drifters, robbers. We hunted them, but they got away. They weren't outlaws. Daniel's words fell like stones into still water. They were your deputies. Tom Hawkins, Bill Fletcher, and Sam Delaney. Your men. And they didn't rob my house. They executed my family on your orders. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the sounds from outside, the piano, the voices, the creak of the gallows, seemed to fade away, leaving only the 2 men and the truth hanging between them like smoke. Brennan's face had gone pale, then flushed red. His hand was fully on his gun now, but he hadn't drawn it. That's quite an accusation, he said, his voice tight. You got proof? Or just the ravings of a broken man? Daniel reached slowly into his coat, slowly enough that Brennan could see he wasn't going for a weapon, and pulled out a leather-bound journal. He tossed it onto the desk between them. It landed with a heavy thud, sending papers scattering. Tom Hawkins kept records, Daniel said. Every job you hired them for, every throat they cut, every body they buried, including my wife's, including my daughter's. His voice caught slightly on the last word, the first crack in his composure. She was 7 years old, Brennan. 7. The sheriff stared at the journal as if it were a snake coiled on his desk. His breathing had grown heavier, his face shining with sweat despite the cool interior. Where did you get that? Found it in what was left of Hawkins after I caught up to him in Arizona. He talked before he died. Told me everything. How you needed my land for the railroad. How I wouldn't sell. How you decided it was easier to make me disappear than negotiate. Daniel's hands had curled into fists at his sides, trembling now with barely contained rage. You killed my family for a railroad contract. Brennan stood slowly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. His hand was still on his gun, and now the calculation in his eyes had shifted. This wasn't shock anymore. This was a cornered animal deciding whether to fight or flee. Even if any of that were true, Brennan said carefully. What exactly do you think you're going to do about it? You can't prove anything. Hawkins is dead. You said so yourself. A dead man's journal won't hold up against a sheriff's word. I'm not here for legal justice, Daniel replied. Legal justice died with my family. I'm here to give you a choice. Brennan's laugh was harsh and ugly. A choice? What kind of choice? Daniel's eyes, gray as storm clouds and just as cold, locked onto Brennan's. Sunrise tomorrow. Main Street. You and me. We settle this the old way. A duel. Brennan's expression twisted into something between disbelief and contempt. You're challenging me to a goddamn duel. I'm giving you the chance to die like a man instead of a coward. Daniel's voice was steady again, all emotion locked away behind iron will. More than you gave my wife. More than you gave my daughter. The sheriff's face cycled through several expressions, fear, anger, calculation, before settling into a cold smile. And if I refuse, if I just have my deputies throw you in a cell right now for threatening a lawman, then tomorrow at sunrise, I'll shoot you down in the street anyway, Daniel said simply. But at least this way, you get to pretend you have honor. Get to die with a gun in your hand instead of begging for mercy. Brennan stood there for a long moment, weighing his options. Finally, he nodded slowly. Sunrise. Main Street. Don't be late, Cross. Wouldn't want to deprive the town of a good show. Daniel turned and walked toward the door, then paused with his hand on the frame. Without looking back, He spoke one final time. "You should have killed me 15 years ago, Brennan. That was your only real mistake." As Daniel stepped back into the fading light, the entire town seemed to hold its breath. Word would spread fast. The ghost had returned, and tomorrow, Copper Valley would see blood. News of the challenge spread through Copper Valley like wildfire through dry grass. By the time full dark had fallen, every resident knew that Daniel Cross, a man most had believed long dead or disappeared into the territories, had returned to call out Sheriff Brennan for a sunrise duel. The saloons buzzed with speculation and argument. Was Cross mad with grief? Was Brennan truly guilty of something so monstrous? Would either man even show up come dawn? Daniel spent the evening at the town's only hotel, a 2-story building with sagging floors and thin walls. The proprietor, an elderly woman named Mrs. Chun who'd run the establishment for 30 years, recognized him immediately when he came through the door. "Mr. Cross," she said quietly, her weathered face showing genuine sympathy. "I heard you were back. I'm so sorry about Sarah and little Emma." The names hit Daniel like physical blows, but he kept his expression neutral. "Thank you, Mrs. Chun. I need a room for the night." She handed him a key without asking for payment. "Room 7. It overlooks the street. In case you..." She trailed off, unsure how to finish. "In case I need to watch for assassins?" Daniel finished for her. His smile was grim. Appreciate the thought. Up in his room, Daniel laid out his weapons on the narrow bed. 2 Colt .45 revolvers, cleaned and oiled to perfection. Each gun was an extension of himself now, familiar as his own hands after 15 years of practice. He'd spent countless hours drawing, aiming, firing until the motions were as natural as breathing. Speed mattered, but accuracy mattered more. A fast shot that missed was worthless. He sat in the darkness by the window, watching the street below. The town was quieter than usual, as if everyone had decided to save their energy for tomorrow's spectacle. Daniel's mind wandered despite his attempts to stay focused, drifting back through 15 years to the last night he'd spent in this town. He'd been a different man then. Daniel Cross, small rancher, trying to build something lasting for his family. Sarah had been his light, quick to laugh, strong-willed, beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with physical appearance, and everything to do with the warmth she brought to every room. And Emma, their daughter, had been pure joy. 7 years old, with her mother's dark hair and her father's gray eyes, full of questions about everything and fearless in her curiosity. Brennan had come to him 6 months before the murders. The railroad was planning a route through the valley, and Daniel's land sat right in the path of the proposed line. The offer had been generous, more than the property was worth, but Daniel had refused. His father had built that ranch, had died defending it from raiders. It wasn't about money. It was about legacy, about having something to pass on to Emma. Brennan had smiled and said he understood, had shaken Daniel's hand and promised there'd be no hard feelings, had left like a friend. 2 weeks later, Daniel had ridden into town for supplies. He'd been gone from the ranch for maybe 3 hours. When he returned, he found his house's door hanging open, the interior wrecked, and in the bedroom, he'd found Sarah and Emma, both shot at close range, their bodies positioned to make it look like they'd surprised burglars. The grief had been absolute, overwhelming. For months afterward, Daniel had barely functioned. He drank heavily, slept little, let the ranch fall into disrepair. The local marshal had investigated, concluded it was a robbery gone wrong, and closed the case. No suspects, no leads, no justice. It was only later, after Daniel had emerged from the worst of his grief, like a drowning man breaking the surface, that he'd started asking questions. Why would robbers kill rather than simply tie up their victims? Why had nothing of real value been taken? Sarah's jewelry box had been untouched, Emma's silver locket still around her neck. Why had Brennan been so quick to buy the property from Daniel afterward at a fraction of its worth, claiming to be doing a grief-stricken man a favor? The questions had led to suspicions. The suspicions had led to investigation. And the investigation had taken Daniel on a 15-year journey across 3 territories, tracking down 3 men whose names he'd pulled from careful observation and patient inquiry. Tom Hawkins had been first, Daniel had found him in Arizona, working as a hired gun for a corrupt mine owner. The confrontation had been brief. Hawkins had gone for his gun, and Daniel had been faster. But before he died, Hawkins had talked. Maybe out of spite, maybe seeking absolution. But he'd confirmed everything Daniel had suspected and more. Bill Fletcher had been next, living under a false name in California. He died harder than Hawkins, refusing to confess. But Daniel had found the letters, correspondence with Brennan arranging payment for services rendered. Sam Delaney had been the last, and the hardest to find. He'd gone to ground in the Colorado mountains, living like a hermit. But Daniel had tracked him there, and Delaney had finally broken under questioning, spilling the full story. How Brennan had hired them, how they'd waited until Daniel was gone, how Sarah had fought, clawing at Fletcher's face before Hawkins shot her, how Emma had hidden under the bed, crying, until Delaney had dragged her out and Daniel forced the memory away, his hands clenching on the windowsill. Delaney's death had been slower than the others, much slower. A knock at the door pulled Daniel from his dark thoughts. His hand went immediately to one of the revolvers, and he moved silently to stand beside the door rather than in front of it. "Who is it?" "Thomas Wright. I was marshal here when it happened. I'd like to talk, if you'll allow it." Daniel remembered Wright, a decent man, honest but limited by his jurisdiction and the realities of frontier justice. He opened the door slowly, keeping the gun in his hand, but not pointing it. Wright had aged considerably. His hair was white now, his face lined deeply. He held his hat in his hands and looked at Daniel with something like shame in his eyes. "I should have seen it," Wright said without preamble. "Should have known it wasn't a simple robbery. But Brennan was the local authority, and I took his word over my instincts." "You couldn't have known," Daniel said, though his voice carried little comfort. "I could have investigated harder, could have pushed back when Brennan rushed the conclusion." Wright met Daniel's eyes. "I came to tell you two things. First, if what you claim about Brennan is true, then I failed your family, and I'll carry that guilt to my grave. And second, I won't interfere tomorrow. Whatever happens between you and Brennan, it's outside my jurisdiction now. I retired from the marshal service 3 years ago." He paused. "But I'll be there, as a witness. So whatever the outcome, the truth gets told proper afterward." Daniel studied the old lawman's face, seeing genuine remorse there. "That's all I can ask." Wright nodded and turned to leave, then stopped. "He's scared, you know. Brennan, he's been drinking heavy since you issued the challenge. His hands shake. The whole town's seen it." "Good," Daniel said quietly. "He should be scared. My wife and daughter were terrified when they died. Let him know what that feels like." After Wright left, Daniel returned to his vigil at the window. The hours crawled by, marked by the occasional drunk stumbling home and the distant howl of coyotes in the hills. Daniel didn't sleep. He'd learned years ago that sleep before confrontation was a luxury he couldn't afford. The nightmares were worse than the exhaustion. Around 3 in the morning, he saw movement in the shadows across the street. His hand moved to his gun, but he recognized the figure. A young woman, maybe 20, with long dark hair and a determined set to her jaw. She was staring up at his window, clearly debating something. After a moment, she crossed the street and entered the hotel. Daniel heard quiet voices below, then footsteps on the stairs. Another knock. "Mr. Cross, my name is Rebecca Coleman. I need to speak with you. Please." Daniel opened the door cautiously. Up close, the young woman's resemblance to Sarah was startling. The same dark hair, similar bone structure, but her eyes were different, harder. "I don't know you," Daniel said, "but I know you, or I know what happened to you." Rebecca's voice trembled slightly, but she pushed forward. "My father was James Coleman. He owned the land next to yours. 6 years ago, after you left, Brennan came to him with the same offer he'd made you. Railroad land. My father refused, just like you did." Daniel felt his stomach tighten. "What happened?" "Fire," Rebecca said simply. "The ranch house burned down in the night. My father, my mother, my 2 brothers, all of them died. The official investigation called it an accident. Faulty lamp, they said. Her eyes blazed with tears and fury. But I know it was Brennan. I've always known. I just couldn't prove it. Why are you telling me this? Because tomorrow, you're going to kill him. And when you do, I want you to know you're not just avenging your family. You're avenging mine too. And probably others. She reached into her coat and pulled out a folder stuffed with papers. I've spent 6 years collecting these. Property records, death certificates, transfer documents. There's a pattern. Anyone who refused to sell to the railroad ended up dead or disappeared. And every time, Brennan benefited somehow. Daniel took the folder, flipping through its contents. His hands began to shake as he realized the scope of what Rebecca had uncovered. This wasn't just about his family. Brennan had orchestrated perhaps a dozen murders over the years, all in service of greed and the railroad's expansion. This is evidence, Daniel said hoarsely. Real evidence. You could take this to the territorial governor, the federal marshals. And how long would that take? Rebecca interrupted bitterly. How many years of investigation and trials? How many ways for Brennan to weasel out with his connections and his money? She shook her head. No. Tomorrow, you end this the right way. The frontier way. And then these documents become the proof that you were justified. Daniel looked at the young woman's fierce expression and saw an echo of his own rage, his own need for justice. Thank you, he said quietly. Make the shot count, Rebecca replied. For all of us. After she left, Daniel laid the documents carefully beside his guns. The weight of what he carried now was greater than just personal vengeance. He was the instrument of justice for families who would never see legal retribution, for victims whose deaths had been covered up and forgotten. As the first gray light of dawn began to touch the eastern sky, Daniel stood and began his final preparations. He checked each gun one last time, tested their weight and balance. He dressed carefully, making sure nothing would impede his draw. And then he walked to the window to watch the sun rise on the last day of Sheriff Marcus Brennan's life. The ghost had returned, and Copper Valley would never be the same. The main street of Copper Valley at dawn was eerily silent. The saloon, usually buzzing with late-night drinkers and gamblers, had closed early. The shops remained shuttered. Even the dogs that normally roamed the streets had disappeared, as if sensing the violence that hung in the air like storm clouds on the horizon. Daniel Cross walked down the center of the street, his boots kicking up small puffs of dust that glowed golden in the early morning light. The sun was just breaking over the eastern mountains, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink that seemed obscene given what was about to happen. Death should come with darkness, Daniel thought, not with this beautiful dawn. But nature didn't care about human violence. The sun rose regardless. People lined both sides of the street, pressed against walls and gathered on porches, keeping a safe distance from the killing ground but unwilling to miss what might be the most significant event in Copper Valley's history. Daniel could feel their eyes on him, could hear their whispered speculations and bets. Some sympathized with him, the grieving husband and father seeking justice. Others thought her mad, a man consumed by grief and conspiracy theories, challenging legitimate authority. Let them think what they wanted. After today, the truth would speak for itself. At the far end of the street, the sheriff's office door opened. Marcus Brennan stepped out onto the porch, and even from 100 yards away, Daniel could see the man's condition. Right had been right. Brennan was scared. His face was pale beneath his hat, his movements stiff and unnatural. He'd armed himself heavily, 2 revolvers at his hips, a rifle in his hands, and Daniel could see the bulge of at least one more hidden weapon beneath his coat. Overkill, Daniel thought grimly. The weapons of a man who'd never faced a fair fight, who relied on superior firepower and dirty tricks. Brennan descended from the porch slowly, almost reluctantly. Behind him, 2 of his deputies lingered in the doorway, young men who probably didn't know the full extent of their boss's crimes. They looked nervous, hands hovering near their own weapons. "I see you brought an audience," Daniel called out, his voice carrying clearly in the morning stillness. "Planning to have your boys shoot me in the back if I win." "This is a legal duel," Brennan shouted back, his voice cracking slightly. "Witnessed by the town. My deputies are here as peace officers, nothing more." The way Hawkins, Fletcher, and Delaney were just peace officers. Daniel took another step forward, closing the distance. "Tell me, Brennan, did they enjoy murdering women and children? Did you pay them extra for that?" A ripple of shock ran through the crowd. This accusation was being made publicly now, with dozens of witnesses. Brennan's face flushed dark red. "You're a liar and a madman," Brennan spat. "Your grief has twisted your mind. I showed you nothing but compassion after your loss, and this is how you repay me." Compassion. Daniel's laugh was harsh and bitter. He pulled the leather journal from his coat and held it high so the crowd could see. "This is Tom Hawkins's personal record. Every job you hired him for. Every murder you ordered, including my family's." He threw the journal toward the crowd, where it landed in the dust near the boardwalk. "Read it yourselves. See what kind of man wears that badge." "Lies written by a dead outlaw," Brennan shouted, but his voice had lost confidence, probably forged by Cross himself to justify his insanity. "Then let's ask Bill Fletcher. Oh wait, he's dead too. Died with your letters in his pocket." Daniel took another step, then another. The distance between them was shrinking. Or Sam Delaney. But he's also dead. Funny how everyone who knew the truth ended up that way. "You admit to murder." Brennan seized on this desperately. "You just confessed to killing 3 men. That makes you the criminal here, not me." "I executed 3 men who killed my family on your orders," Daniel corrected coldly. "And now I'm here to execute you. The only question is whether you'll face it like a man or die begging like the coward you are." Brennan's hand dropped to his revolver. The crowd gasped and pressed back further. Every eye was locked on the 2 men, now standing about 50 feet apart in the center of the street. "Thomas Wright." Brennan called out suddenly. "You were marshal here. You investigated Sarah Cross's death. Tell these people I had nothing to do with it." Wright stepped forward from the crowd, his weathered face grave. "I investigated it as a robbery, but I've seen new evidence since then." He gestured toward the journal lying in the dust. "Evidence that suggests Sheriff Brennan's involvement. Evidence I wish I'd uncovered 15 years ago." The crowd's murmur grew louder. Brennan's face had gone from red to pale white. He was losing the crowd, losing the narrative he'd controlled for so long. "Enough talk," Daniel said quietly. His hands hung loose at his sides, fingers flexed and ready. "You wanted this to look legal, Brennan. So here's how it works. Traditional rules. We stand, we draw, we fire. First man to hit wins. You don't get to use that rifle. This is revolvers only." Brennan hesitated, then reluctantly leaned the rifle against a nearby water trough. His hands moved to his holstered guns. "Fine, but when I kill you, Cross, don't expect any mercy for your memory. You'll be buried as a madman who attacked a lawman." "If you kill me," Daniel replied calmly, "then I'll have failed, and you'll have gotten away with murder again. But that's not going to happen." The sun had fully cleared the mountains now, flooding the street with bright morning light that eliminated all shadows. Perfect conditions. No excuses. "We need a count," Brennan said, looking around nervously. "Someone to officiate." Thomas Wright stepped forward again. "I'll do it. When I say draw, you draw. Anyone who pulls before the word is shot by me personally." He produced his own revolver, holding it loosely but meaningfully. Brennan licked his lips nervously. Daniel simply nodded. Wright moved to the side of the street, positioning himself where he could see both men clearly. The crowd had gone completely silent. Even the wind seemed to have died, leaving the morning still and breathless. "Gentlemen," Wright said formally, though the word seemed ironic given the circumstances. "This is a challenge duel, called by Daniel Cross against Sheriff Marcus Brennan. The terms are 1 draw, 1 shot, witnessed combat. Are both parties willing?" "Yes," Daniel said immediately. Brennan hesitated for just a moment, then nodded jerkily. "Yes, then on my count." Wright raised his hand. 3, 2, 1 draw. The world seemed to slow down. Daniel had experienced this before in gunfights, time stretching like taffy, every movement crystal clear. He saw Brennan's hand drop toward his gun, saw the sheriff's fingers close around the grip. But Brennan was slow, slowed by fear and alcohol and lack of practice. Daniel's own draw was smooth as silk, the result of 15 years of practice and preparation. His Colt cleared leather and came up in one fluid motion, his thumb cocking the hammer even as his arm extended. He didn't aim, didn't need to. His body knew the angle, the distance, the weight of the weapon. Brennan's gun was only halfway out of its holster when Daniel fired. The shot cracked across the morning like thunder, echoing off the buildings. Brennan jerked backward, his own weapon falling from nerveless fingers as he clutched his chest. Blood bloomed dark against his tin shirt, spreading rapidly. The sheriff staggered, took 2 stumbling steps backward, then fell heavily onto his back in the dust. His breath came in wet, gurgling gasps. His eyes were wide with shock and terror as he stared up at the beautiful morning sky. Daniel walked forward slowly, his gun still drawn and ready. He stopped standing over Brennan, looking down at the dying man who'd destroyed his life. "Sarah," Daniel said quietly. "Emma, James Coleman and his family. All the others you killed, or had killed. Remember their names as you die." Brennan tried to speak, blood bubbling at his lips. His mouth worked soundlessly, whether trying to confess or curse. Daniel would never know. After a moment, the light faded from the sheriff's eyes, and he went still. The street remained silent for several heartbeats. Then Thomas Wright's voice cut through the stillness. "Witness that this was a fair duel, called and accepted according to frontier law. Sheriff Marcus Brennan was defeated by Daniel Cross in honest combat." The crowd began to move then, pressing forward to see the body, to examine the journal that still lay in the dust, to process what they'd just witnessed. Daniel stood motionless in the center of the street, his gun hanging at his side, feeling nothing except the hollow emptiness where his rage had burned for 15 years. Justice was done, but it couldn't bring back the dead. It couldn't return what Brennan had stolen. Rebecca Coleman pushed through the crowd and stood beside Daniel. She didn't speak, just placed her folder of documents on Brennan's still chest, the evidence that would tell the full story, that would vindicate Daniel and expose the conspiracy. "It's done," she said quietly. "Yes," Daniel replied. "It's done." But as he looked at the growing crowd, at their shocked faces and nervous whispers, he knew the real work was just beginning. The ghost had returned not just for vengeance, but to clean the rot from Copper Valley. And that would take more than one bullet at dawn. But the story isn't over. Not yet. The hardest trials still lie ahead. The truth still waits to be revealed. And when everything comes to a head, what will happen to our heroes? Part 2 holds all the answers. Don't miss the continuation.